Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 201. And here today we continue with our fourth time period and theme, American Culture in a Time of Demographic Change. At this moment in the class, we are examining the cultural consequences of demographic shifts that begin in 1965 with the Hart-Celler Act, which would lead to changes in patterns of immigration, as well as the effects of the civil rights movement of that period. And so in this final time period, we're thinking about how America has changed demographically over the last few decades and how those changes have sparked debates about the nature of the American community and this question of who is an American. In this lecture, we're going to examine a debate in American culture that took place as a result of this greater diversity, heterogeneity, changes in American demography since 1965, namely the multiculturalism debate, a debate about what we value, what we teach our children, as America became increasingly diverse in the late 20th century. Multiculturalism debate will sound a lot like the debates we're having right now, considering what we teach our children or how we think about the American community. There are many analogs between the culture wars today concerning issues like critical race theory, transgender rights, that you will see connected to the multiculturalism debate of the 1990s. Many scholars are looking at our contemporary America and the debates we're having regarding American culture, representation, how we think about the American community, and the debates we had in the 1990s. So in this lecture, we're going to doodaloo, go back to the 1990s, an era of grunge rock, the Clinton era, the golden age of hip hop, and examine American culture in the 1990s, the multiculturalism debate that rippled through America in this period, and the way in which it's connected to the changing demographics that we have examined in this portion of the class. Let's begin by reviewing those changing demographics. In 1965, Congress passes, President Johnson signs into law the Hart-Celler Act, which had a number of key consequences, again, which we talked about thoroughly in that lecture on immigration reform. One, it led to a steep rise in immigration. Prior to the Hart-Celler Act, immigration was in many ways stunted. It wasn't a major factor in American life. From the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 through the Hart-Celler Act, there had been a steep decline in immigration. The other effect, in addition to a general rise in the volume and number of immigrants to this country, a change in where those immigrants are coming from. It's a point we made time and time again in that lecture on the Hart-Celler Act. The people who come after 1965 tended to come from Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Southwest Asia, or what one may describe as the Middle East. Those parts of the world previously were not major sources of immigration. So not only do we have more immigrants coming after 65, but we have them coming from parts of the world that had not yet been major sources of immigration, and that led to changes in demography, ethnically, racially, and religiously. Then, well, here's some evidence to that, just some more statistics. In the last few decades of the 20th century, twice as many immigrants come from Africa as the entire 200-year plus period of involuntary immigration of the Atlantic slave trade. The first African slaves arrive in what will later be America in 1619 in colonial Virginia. And the Atlantic slave trade continued into the very early 19th century. So over almost a 200-year period, and during that period, of course, millions of slaves were brought to this country as involuntary immigrants. But in just 30 years, from 1970 to the end of the 20th century, you have twice that number coming now as voluntary immigrants from Africa. That really speaks to, again, those elements of the Hart-Celler Act and the way they affected changing demographics that I noted here at the beginning of this lecture. Then you have some other trends that are important in helping you understand the creation of the multicultural America of the late 20th century and the debates it sparked. Globalization meant labor flows across national boundaries. In the late 20th century, the global economy shifts from, again, one centered on manufacturing sites to instead flows of capital and labor and information and representations and ideas That meant that now you had people coming to this country from places throughout the world to participate in that now information service sector based economy. Many of the immigrants who come after 65 come from places like South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, knowledge workers, engineers, computer scientists, doctors, and that of course has affected the greater diversity in America. And then again, with globalization comes greater ideas, images, representations circulating across the globe that also serve to make America increasingly a multicultural space. In the late 20th century, another force that's driving immigration and the creation of a multicultural America, refugee programs, where the United States expanded the number of immigrants even beyond the general cap established under the Hart-Celler Act to accommodate people fleeing oppression, particularly in the Cold War, Cuban refugees who could make their way to the United States. In the late 70s, early 80s, we had refugee programs that opened the doors to those fleeing oppression in Southeast Asia, particularly after America's loss in the American War in Vietnam. And so you had a large influx of Vietnamese immigrants, Cambodian immigrants, Hmong immigrants. And then after the Cold War, when many of the after effects of the Cold War continued to shape politics in Eastern Europe, in events like the Bosnian conflict, in Africa, the post-Cold War world remained a space of tumult, unease, unsteadiness, a lot of it a result of Cold War policies. And again, that meant more immigrants who were able to come from those war-torn regions or previously during the Cold War claiming refugee status, fleeing from communist countries like Cuba. So you have all of these forces: globalization, immigration reform, international instability, the Cold War and its post-Cold War effects, and then you have again alongside this civil rights. And this is why in those lectures we worked hard to connect all of these themes and developments: Cold War, civil rights, immigration reform. They're all interrelated. They all overlap in a variety of ways. And here we return to that in describing the more diverse, pluralistic, heterogeneous America we live in today, where not only we have seen a large influx of immigrants from Africa, Asia, Latin America, we have seen our institutions change, where now there are institutions of power and authority in politics, in culture, in the economy, in academia, that are open to American citizens of color in ways never possible before. And so you have the rise of Latinos as an increasingly visible minority group, particularly a growing Latino middle class. You have the greater visibility of Latinos in politics and pop culture. Asian Americans, African Americans working in professions that in the pre-civil rights era were closed to them. So all of this, too, is important in understanding the debate about values, about the American character, about who we are as a nation. That is our focus here in this final lecture. Not only have we seen a large influx of immigrants, we've also seen greater opportunities for American-born citizens, Latinos, Asian Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, to vault into positions of prominence that they hadn't been denied in the pre-civil rights era. And that's why when you look at institutions of authority and influence in America today, they look very different than they did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because there are so many people of color, women, sexual minorities in those positions, and that too has played a role in the multiculturalism debate that is our focus here. Let's focus on African Americans in the last few decades, because it's a good way of thinking about the change and unchange in the civil rights era, what did change, what didn't change, and how that lack of change has sparked debates about race in the multiculturalism debate. With the end of Jim Crow segregation, with now opportunities in education, employment, housing, African Americans have been able to indeed vault into professions that had been closed to them. They have achieved greater prominence in certain institutions in American life. For example, in the police force. In 1970, there were only 24,000 African Americans working in city police departments around the country. And this was a big issue, as we talked about in the latter stage of the civil rights era in the 60s and 70s, when, after the achievements of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, civil rights efforts tended to focus on what had not changed, including police departments that were largely staffed by white officers and patrolling communities of color where the majority of people were African American, racial minorities living in urban areas. And you had the long hot summer of 1967, major areas of unrest in Newark, in cities around the country. Previous to that, you had the Watts insurrection in 1965 here in Los Angeles, which was directly sparked by a white LAPD officer manhandling and abusing a black female motorist that had been detained by that officer. And Watts was a largely African American part of Los Angeles. It developed as such owing to the residential segregation that prevailed in Southern California and Los Angeles prior to the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Fair Housing Act. And so you had a majority African American population, but the LA Police Department was majority white. And quite often, as in that incident that led to the Watts insurrection, an all-white police force was routinely abusing the African American population of Watts. And so you had the Watts insurrection of 65, you had the long hot summer of 1967. There were all of these actions by African Americans and other racial minorities around the country in the late 60s objecting to a police force that was majority white, again, policing and often abusing a majority minority population. Well, the remedy for that was to open up police forces to people of color, and that's why you've seen this large growth in that occupation, an occupation that is, again, funded by the government, a union job, sort of jobs that were foreclosed to African Americans prior to the civil rights changes of this period. By the end of the 20th century, more than a third of African Americans had attended some college. Not all graduated. Not all these were four-year institutions. But again, this is a remarkable shift from where we were in the early 60s when it was very transgressive and difficult to imagine someone like James Meredith stepping foot on the campus of the University of Mississippi, where African Americans were very rare on the campus of major universities. And a few decades later, African Americans are attending college, they're earning degrees, they're vaulting into that middle class. However, here is the unchange of this period, where despite the opportunities that civil rights has offered, we have in 2007 an unemployment rate double that of whites, African Americans still subject to high poverty rates, half of all African American children living in poverty. And so this again is a way of thinking about the debates we are having still in the early 21st century that began in the late 20th century about race and civil rights and its legacy, where we can rightfully acknowledge the change, the revolutionary change, as we did in those lectures regarding civil rights, how in the 50s, 60s, and 70s there's this dramatic legal revolution that does open up new opportunities for people of color. But at the same time, you can only change so much when you change the laws. It's difficult to reverse centuries of discrimination, as we learned about a lot, not just in our lectures on civil rights, but more recently in regards to the post-war ideal. A lot of the institutions that allow you to build wealth, like homeownership, have been effectively closed off to African Americans. With the rise of the conservative movement in the 70s and 80s, there was an effort to defund urban areas, and they became zones of economic underdevelopment, and many racial minorities were trapped in those parts of the nation, while suburbs and other areas benefited from investment. So you had the decay of great urban areas like Detroit, which further intensified this gap, this divide in terms of wealth, income between racial minorities and the white majority. So we see the dramatic changes of civil rights and their effects, but we can also see how little has changed in regards to the economic fate of African Americans as a result of centuries of discrimination, of continuing forms of discrimination, and the way in which for generations African Americans have been locked out of the things that offer real capital, real wealth growth. College education, home ownership. Again, most Americans accrue wealth not by saving money, but by enjoying the greater equity in their home. Well, if you were denied a chance to buy a house in the 50s and 60s owing to racial discrimination, if the houses you could buy were in depressed urban areas that were subject to deindustrialization, factory jobs evaporating, deinvestment in cities, well, the house you could buy is now worth less than it was in the 70s and 80s, meaning that you've lost wealth. So all of these factors, again, play a role in the lack of change that we can see, and that's why we're having continued debates in this country today regarding the legacy of discrimination and racism, and why race increasingly is the focus in the culture wars of the early 21st century. This is a point I made in previous lectures, that a lot of what we focused on here in the last couple weeks, gender, sexuality, pornography, the sexual revolution, those are less prominent, with the exception of abortion, less prominent elements of the modern culture wars. Instead, in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, we've seen the culture war shift away from issues of gender, sexuality, the legacy of the sexual revolution, to what now seems to be the hot button issues in regards to the culture wars, race and immigration. And this final lecture is designed to bring you into that contemporary context, where today there's a lot of debate about this issue of a wealth gap between racial minorities and whites, and why such a wealth gap exists. Despite the opportunities and reforms that civil rights offered, why does this problem persist? And that, again, is one of the foci of the modern culture wars. As I've mentioned in previous lectures, it's hard to talk about pop culture of the 1980s because so many of the figures associated with it have gone on to do loathsome and terrible things. Bill Cosby, Michael Jackson, Hulk Hogan, Roseanne Barr, name any pop culture figure from the 1980s and somehow they've proven themselves to be problematic. But in the 1980s, the most popular show on television was The Cosby Show, starring Bill Cosby. And it was saluted at the time because it offered an image of successful middle-class African Americans thriving in the Reagan era. African Americans previously on television were almost invisible in the background, or relegated to working class images. Sanford and Son from the 70s, Good Times from the 1970s, those landmark Norman Lear sitcoms of the 70s that brought African Americans back to television after they had been again largely invisible through the late 50s and 1960s. But those programs, like Sanford and Son and Good Times, confined African Americans to working class jobs. But with the Cosby Show, you had an image of a thriving middle class, upper middle class African American experience, and that's why it received such acclaim and celebration. Cliff Huxtable was a doctor. His wife was a lawyer. All their children, yes, including Theo, eventually go to college. And so that television program was seen as demonstrative of what African Americans were achieving in the 1980s and the decades that followed civil rights. But again, you can only change so much in 1 or 2 generations. You can only change so much when only laws change. And though we do see these images from the Cosby Show onward today to Blackish of African American success, there are these startling statistics that speak to the lack of change. Remember, as we talked about with civil rights, in the late 60s, civil rights turned its attention to economic concerns. You had Dr. King and the Poor People's Campaign. You had the effort to create another jobs program, a federal jobs program that would ameliorate poverty. And in the late 60s, early 70s, the country makes a conservative turn. And those efforts are stymied, thwarted, and in many ways reversed. And that explains again why, despite our images today of the Cosby Show onward, we still see high poverty rates, low wealth rates for African Americans, lower home ownership rates. Statistics here to support that. And that again brings us hopefully into 2020, into the contemporary age, where not only are racial issues the center of the modern culture wars, much more so than feminism, gay rights, and pornography, but also how those debates about race in the modern culture wars tend to center on these questions of history, legacy, change, and unchange, where the nation is urged to think in a very complicated way that's often very challenging for many Americans, where we can acknowledge, yes, a lot has changed since the 1950s and 1960s, where thanks to the dogged, determined, deliberate efforts of African Americans and other racial minorities, we're a much more equitable nation. If it wasn't for those sacrifices that have made us a better nation, we wouldn't be in the position we are today. African Americans and other racial minorities in the civil rights effort advanced a more just, equitable, free America. Thanks to their sacrifices, we can see those changes, but at the same time, we have to keep in mind the lack of change. How in the course of civil rights there were very little efforts to really address the true issues of opportunity, freedom, economic issues, jobs. Dr. King's unable to launch his Poor People's Campaign because he's assassinated by a white supremacist. And so here in the statistics, here in our discussion in the slide of African Americans, we have a way of thinking about these issues about race, demography, change, unchange that are in the heart of the contemporary debate about a more diverse, pluralistic America that has been simultaneously transformed by civil rights and immigration reform, but remains a nation separate and unequal. The term I've been using so far, the term that is at the heart, the center of this lecture, is multiculturalism, and it first began to appear in our public culture beyond academia in the 1990s, when there was a greater awareness of the way in which, as a result of immigration reform and civil rights, America was becoming increasingly pluralistic, heterogeneous in the late 20th century, in the final decade of that century. Americans by the 1990s could see this in their neighborhoods, in their schools, in, again, their public, political, and popular culture. If you turned on a TV in the 1990s, if you engaged in American public life, you could see the effects of demographic change. It was that decade of the Prop 187 debate here in California, the Minutemen down at the border, many debates, as we will see in this lecture, about how America had been transformed by these changes. And one of the lessons to take away from this class, or any history class, is we invent a language to describe the times in which we live. We needed a word to describe the more pluralistic, heterogeneous America we had clearly become as a result of civil rights and immigration reform by the 1990s. And that word was multiculturalism. But it's important to note that multiculturalism was not simply a descriptive term. It wasn't only a way of describing the America we now lived in, where our institutions of authority and influence looked more diverse and heterogeneous. It was also a call for continuing that process of integration, of ending discrimination, of opening opportunities, so that the lack of change in terms of educational and economic outcomes could be addressed by further efforts of pluralism and opportunity for immigrants and racial minorities. So multiculturalism was also a political term. It was one that called for greater opportunities. It was one that called for making our institutions look like the America they serve. Because in the 1990s, though we had seen these changes in demography, many of the institutions in American life remained largely dominated by whites. And so you had police forces that were still majority white. You had faculty and public schools and universities that was mostly white, teaching majority minority population. And so multiculturalism wasn't just descriptive, it was also a call for, again, further efforts of integration, pluralism, to make, again, our institutions look more like the people they are intended to serve. Diversity in the workforce, diversity in education, revision of university curriculum. That was also a big part of the multiculturalism effort of the 1990s, where we wanted children to see themselves in the books they were assigned in school, to have a university curriculum that offered departments of Asian American Studies, African American Studies, Women's Studies, so that, again, a public university, which is designed to serve the public, does have a curriculum that reflects the interests, background, and experiences of the public. In the 1970s and 1980s, there were intense debates on college campuses like ours to add to the catalog, add to the curriculum, add to the university new departments that, again, were more responsive to the new student populations and the new America. In the 70s and 80s, you had intense debates on college campuses around the country about adding to the university experience departments of African American Studies, Latino Studies, Native American Studies. Now, when you, if you're not graduating this quarter, you're coming back in the fall, begin to fill out your schedule for fall. You have a chance to choose classes that just weren't available to your parents or grandparents if they attended a university because they didn't exist. When you look through the schedule and you try to find a class that fits with your interests and your work schedule, when you go through rate my professors and eliminate all the terrible professors that give you too much work, when you go through that whole process of deciding what classes you're going to enroll in, what classes you're going to take, you have opportunities today that just did not exist 20, 30 years ago because there was an effort, again, a dogged, deliberate effort in the 70s and 80s to expand our curriculum and offer classes that today we can take for granted but did not exist in the 70s and 80s. Fields like African American Studies, Latino Studies, Queer Studies, Women's Studies. Now, the fight for these was so dogged and determined because when you establish a Department of Women's Studies on a college campus, you are saying there's something intellectually important, significant about this field, and it should be funded by the taxpayers that fund this university. It has a place alongside traditional fields of knowledge like philosophy, a department of astronomy, a department of classics, a department of English. The units are all the same, right? There's no differentiation, maybe a number of units, but qualitative, in terms of qualitative distinction, there's no difference between a 4-unit class in women's studies and a 4-unit class in biology. So the establishment of these departments says that this university, the taxpayers that fund this university, the community it serves, believes that there is something of equal weight and merit for a Department of Latino Studies as a Department of Philosophy, a Department of Biology, a Department of Computer Science. So there was a dogged, determined effort to establish such a way of thinking, such a leveling that would put in the same catalog with the same unit value a Department of African American Studies, Asian American Studies, Native American Studies alongside more traditional fields of knowledge. But those efforts were dogged, they were determined, and they have borne fruit because we can look at that here on our campus and campuses around the nation. And then those more established traditional fields of knowledge also began to change in reflection of this multiculturalism imperative to have institutions like public universities better serve the public. It is a way of us, again, thinking about that question that so plagued us in our lectures on civil rights and citizenship. Who is an American? Who is the public? Who is the public that is to be served in a public university? Well, there was an effort to expand that notion of the public by adding new departments and also to revise established traditional fields like literature, philosophy, history, and revise their curriculum to, again, offer a better way of serving the public. Now, this was accomplished in a couple of ways. There were efforts to hire people of color women on the faculty of universities, so that the faculty itself reflects the diversity of backgrounds and experiences of the student population. If you look at the faculty of our department, it looks very different than it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that, again, is a function of all these changes that we're discussing here in this lecture. But also syllabi, what texts you assign, what you emphasize in a class. Also revised, so that if you take a American literature class, you will read not just Hemingway and Thoreau, but you will read Amy Chua, you will read writers of color, women of color, because they too wrote great American works. They too wrote great American novels. They too contributed to what we imagine as American literature. This class, History 117B. This is U.S. history from 1945 to the present, where I have to miraculously, in 10 weeks, study 75 years of American history and communicate it to students in 10 weeks, even though those 75 years include things like, I don't know, the Cold War, civil rights, all the dramatic changes we've talked here. This is a class that's designed to teach 75 years of U.S. history. How do you do that, though? Who do you focus on? Who do you emphasize? Well, a class like this 40, 50 years ago would go president by president, right, and focus on them as the great influencers on American history. These are the men who did the things that shaped American history. That's a traditional approach to U.S. history. But in this class, we've tried to think about the SDS. We've tried to think about Cesar Chavez. We've tried to think about Betty Friedan. I've used a lot of movies and TV shows as evidence, all different ways of approaching a class that reflect, again, changes in America in the last few decades, so that a class like this is very different today than it would have been offered 20, 30 years ago. I routinely and will, in the summer and fall, teach a class on the American Civil War. And a class like this has been offered on this college campus for decades. It's the same event, the U.S. Civil War, 1861, 1865. But how do you tell that story? Do you tell it by going from gods and generals approach of battles and the efforts of generals and politicians? Or do you include the experience of women in wartime, Native Americans, African Americans who served in the Union Army, helping to fight for the emancipation of millions of enslaved people? There are many different ways of telling these stories, and what multiculturalism has urged is a way of diversifying that process to include people who had been previously excluded. So along with the growth of these new fields of knowledge, established fields of knowledge have changed so that when you take a American history, American literature course, you're not just following the great white men on parade as they go by. You are instead learning about the contributions of people of color, women, sexual minorities that are also equal in importance and contributory to the story of American history. Also, by the late 20th century, you're starting to see the effects in terms of public opinion that came with civil rights, the sexual revolution, feminism, gay rights. Public opinion poll in 1987 revealed that just 45% of the American public thought it was acceptable to date outside your race. Startling, right? To imagine that less than a majority of Americans in 1987, not that long ago, accepted the idea of interracial dating. In 2003, just less than 20 years later, in the span of one generation, the number of Americans who said it was acceptable to date outside one's race had increased dramatically from 45 to 78%. Now, you might say, what the hell's wrong with that last 22%, right? But as we've learned recently, racism, white supremacy, suspicion of racial minorities, that's a stubborn force, hard to eradicate. So it is troubling that in 2003, 22% of the American public still had an objection to interracial dating. But look at that shift again within one generation. In 1987, half of the American public thought it was acceptable to fire a public school teacher simply because he or she may be gay or lesbian. By 2003, that number had dropped to 35. Now again, what is wrong with that 35% who would rationalize and accept the idea of firing someone simply because they were gay or lesbian? But again, you see changes in public opinion also as a result of, again, the changes that we have described for some time coming out of the 60s and 70s in regard to things like civil rights, feminism, gay rights. So it isn't just institutions that are changing, it's public opinion. And public opinion, as I've stressed throughout this class, is stubborn and difficult to change. But we have seen even that change in reflection of these larger changes in American demography. And so by the late 20th century, America is awash in this multiculturalism debate regarding race, gender, sexuality, the legacy of the changes brought by civil rights and immigration reform. Changes that are reflected in our institutions and public opinion and in our popular culture. This is a dramatic shift, again, in just the last few decades, where today in film, in sports, in television, in music, in cuisine, all of these key elements of popular culture, consumerism, we have seen very different representations that reflect a more multicultural America. The majority of people playing baseball for the MLB, Latinos. The majority of the fan base, Latinos. The music we listen to, the films we watch, increasingly reflective of this multicultural America. And with that has come, again, evidence of change, but also a lot of alarm and misgiving, a lot of larger debate about these changes, because some Americans turn on their TV, open up their Netflix account, download their playlist, and enjoy and are inspired by, moved by this greater diversity. These changes have brought great opportunities for people of color, women, and sexual minorities to be of great influence in shaping our imagination. Pop culture, the reason we have mined it so much in this class, is again a barometer measure of different historical periods, and to see these changes gives us a good idea about what is now possible in 2020 America. But for other Americans who see this on their television, in the music their children listen to, in the cuisine available at the mall food court, these changes are troubling and unsettling. And you have the debates that are our focus here in this final lecture, and that are so manifest in America in 2020. So the multiculturalism debate is this debate about these changes and what they mean for values, what they mean for our sense of the American character. Now, conservatives certainly raised objections to multiculturalism, and they tended to see it as a betrayal of a certain American identity and values, that it was one of fragmentation, where people were encouraged to identify with their racial background, their immigrant or ethnic background, their sexual identities, in a way that betrayed their commitment to the whole, to us, a consensus opinion. They charged multiculturalism as playing identity politics, where again people politicize their identity as a racial minority, sexual minority. And for them, conservatives, this was very alarming because they saw this as denigrating to an American identity. That an African American identity, Asian American identity so emphasizes racial background in a way that precludes a common identity. But it wasn't just conservatives who made that argument. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in 1992 wrote a book called The Disuniting of America, and nobody would call Schlesinger a conservative. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. is arguably the most famous historian of the 20th century. Now, that's not much of an accomplishment to be the most famous historian, right? You know, that's like richest hobo, right? You know, it isn't much of an accomplishment because we historians are not exactly famous, right? They're not well known. But there actually was an age where you would turn on TV and actually see a historian giving a point of view or opinion. And Schlesinger was ubiquitous on television in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He was a professor at Harvard. He served in the Kennedy administration. This is what really vaulted him to greater prominence. He was kind of a social butterfly within Camelot, within the Kennedy administration, so he was routinely photographed next to Jackie Kennedy. And so Schlesinger was part of Kennedy's inner circle, an advisor. He served in the Kennedy administration, but he's best known for being a very prominent public intellectual. He wrote many landmark books about Andrew Jackson, the New Deal. But in 1992, during this period of multiculturalism and the debates it engendered, he took a break from his studies of the American past, and he wrote this book about the disuniting of America, where he argued that America was fracturing. And here is a liberal now making that argument that many conservatives also manifest. We talked in our lecture about Prop 27 in our lecture on immigration reform, how it so reflects the backlash to a diversification in California, how it really represented a generational shift between the white flight era of California in the 50s and 60s, where whites fled more racially integrated parts of the country in the East and the Midwest, moved out to Orange County, where again, instrumental in the modern conservative movement, documented in the McGurr book. And then a couple decades later, they looked at their Southern California and it was increasingly Latino. And that led to Prop 27 and the backlash against immigration and the browning of what's sometimes called the browning of California in the late 20th century. Also in the 1990s, there was a big debate here in California regarding affirmative action. And eventually that led to a proposition on the California ballot that banned affirmative action programs solely based on race in UC admissions. So this is another way of thinking about how California, rather than as it is imagined today as some sort of bastion of liberalism, was in the 1990s still a hotbed of conservative reactionary politics that represented this collision between the old California in the 50s and 60s and the new California that has manifested in the last few decades. The United States does not have an official language. There are many countries around the world that have an official language, that have more than one official language. But the United States has steadfastly avoided establishing a national language because of our idea of ourselves as a melting pot, as a nation of immigrants. And so because of that heritage and legacy and image, we have been reluctant to establish one sole official language that might seem exclusionary. However, many states have official languages, and by 2000, almost half had adopted English as the official language. Now, this is purely symbolic. To adopt English is another reason why the United States doesn't have an official language. It doesn't really mean much. It's mostly symbolic, I should say. It does lead to, in some cases, government documents and others only published in English, but mostly it's symbolic because in these 23 states that have English as their official language, you can still speak any language you want. So it doesn't really have much efficacy, but symbols matter. Though it's merely symbolic, symbols matter. And what you have in these 23 states that go out of their way to adopt an official language that, again, doesn't really have much effect is a statement against multiculturalism, pluralism, a claim to, again, one language and with it one identity in a way that, again, punches at, jousts with the idea of many cultures and languages living equally within a state. Quite honestly, I don't understand the idea of English as an official language for the United States because English is a foreign language. There's nothing American about English. It's just as European, just as foreign as, say, I don't know, Spanish. Spanish is a European language. There's nothing American about it. And that's the same for English. It is a European language. If you really want to speak an American language, speak Nahuatl, right? Speak a Native American language. But of course, this isn't about history, accuracy. It's about, again, symbolism, and a symbolism of exclusion that leads these states to exclude any other language other than the language they associate with a very narrow vision of American identity. In previous lectures, we've talked about the AFDC debate and what that says about culture wars, about poverty and income and class. that 1996 Welfare to Work bill not only ended the federal welfare program, but it barred immigrants from receiving food stamps. Again, this is about debates regarding who we are as a nation in the modern culture wars. And when you say this group, though they are here, though they are taxpayers, they are part of our community, are not one of us, you have, again, a key moment in that larger debate. The Welfare to Work bill says that immigrants can't receive SNAP and other assistance programs, saying you may be here, you may be within our nation, you may be, again, our neighbors, our friends, our classmates, but you're not one of us. You're not eligible for public benefits. So that too was part of the identity debate, the multiculturalism debate of this period. Now what's really interesting is, again, the way in which we can think about now 20, almost 30 years of this multiculturalism debate, which began in the 1990s, which expressed these arguments on both sides that still reverberate today. But what has changed since the 1990s? Now, in 2012, the Republican Party nominated Mitt Romney, and many conservatives just assumed, of course, he will beat Barack Obama in the effort of Obama to be reelected, because conservatives said, well, we hate Obama, and doesn't everyone else hate Obama? So when Romney lost, many conservatives were shocked. They thought they were going to win because they, again, assumed that they spoke for most Americans, that most Americans felt like they did about Obama. But instead, Barack Obama won re-election rather handily in that 2012 election against Mitt Romney. And in the aftermath of that defeat, struggling to figure out how they lost, a number of conservatives engaged in what was known as the autopsy, where they reviewed the Romney campaign. And they concluded that the reason why Romney lost was he failed to connect with African American voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters, who by 2012 were an increasingly sizable part of the American electorate. That we now live in America where such groups are prominent in the population. We live in America now where such racial minorities can vote, despite, again, the efforts to make it difficult for them to vote. And so you got to at least make some inroads and win over those constituents which tend to be much more loyal for the Democratic Party. So after Romney's loss in 2012, there were many within the Republican Party and the conservative movement who said we have to reach out to minority voters. We cannot lose 95% of the African American vote. We cannot lose the vast majority of the Latino and Asian American vote. That this is the new reality, this is the new American population, this is the new demography, and we, the Republican Party, cannot solely be the party of white men. That was the spirit and motivation of many reformers within the Republican Party after Romney's loss. Fast forward 4 years later, in the next presidential election, who the Republicans nominate? Donald Trump, who ran explicitly on an anti-immigrant platform and routinely played into the culture wars of multiculturalism with his plan to ban Muslim immigrants, with all of the ways in which he offended people of color. So rather than follow the route advocated by many after Romney's loss of changing the image and the platform of the Republican Party in a way that would be more conducive, appealing to minority voters, accepting that this is now the new America, and you have to win over minority voters. The Republican Party went the exact opposite direction, and it nominated a candidate who so doubled down upon the anti-immigrant, anti-racial minority politics of this era. Now, it's interesting to see what will happen. If Trump is reelected later this year, it would validate that approach of a Republican Party that's committed to winning white voters and being the party of white men. But if Trump loses, will we see that again, that autopsy approach and some sort of reform movement? I don't know. Historians aren't good about talking about the future. We're much more adroit at talking about the past. But this is a real problem for conservatives. Can they continue to be a party for whites only, the Republican Party? Trump proved they could, but it was a very narrow victory. If you 1,000 voters in a few swing states. Can you pull that off again? We'll have to see in 2020. But again, that larger debate within the conservative movement is a function of these changing demography and who can vote in America. Let's conclude this lecture, which is designed to connect a lot of different threads and bring you back into the contemporary age, by talking about, of all things, history textbooks. Not exactly what you would associate with these debates about race, demography, immigration. But in 1992, during this period where multiculturalism is part of the larger public debate, in this period where its political side, calling for reform and change of institutions, is so strong and vocal, in this period of change, there was a call to revise the history standards that the U.S. government creates in an effort to establish one body of standards that all American school children should be held to, accountable for in history instruction on the K through 12 level. Now, most public education is done on the local level and at most on the state level. Federal government funds a lot of education, but doesn't really have a hand in shaping curriculum. This is reflected in the way in which I always hear from students, I had a terrible history teacher in high school, or I hated history before I came to college. Yeah, because your history teacher was the wrestling coach, right? You didn't even have a degree in history. And on the K through 12 level, quite often that's the experience where, because it's done on the local level by the local school board, they don't really have much in terms of federal guidelines in terms of how to teach history in the K through 12 level. So you find the wrestling coach yelling at you a few days a week about World War II. But there is at least an effort by the federal government to set guidelines. And in 1992, there was an effort to revise the existing guidelines to reflect the more multicultural America, to include in history standards more people of color, to tell the story of World War II, the Civil War, the American Revolution, in a way that incorporated people who had long been excluded from our textbooks, to have textbooks that look more like the students that read them, to have textbooks that include Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Fred Korematsu, Dr. King, and many others who had been invisible in textbooks prior. So in 1992, a blue ribbon panel of historians were cobbled together to rewrite these standards with this idea of offering a more inclusive vision of American history. It's the same history, right? Again, that's the point I made earlier. How you tell the story, though, is variable and can change. Who do you include? Who do you emphasize? Again, we could tell the story of the Civil War in many different ways, focusing on politicians, battles, and generals, or by focusing on workers, enslaved people, free blacks, women. It's the same story. How do you tell that story? Well, in 1992, there was an effort to tell the story in a more inclusive way. And historians went to work and came back in 1994 and released those standards. One of my professors at San Diego State was involved in this, and he later co-authored a book about the history wars, and it's a great book where he reflected on his experience that came with the controversies when the standards were released in 1994, when many, particularly conservatives, objected to the greater emphasis on slavery, the greater emphasis on American imperialism, the greater emphasis on people of color. Lynn Cheney, then a prominent conservative figure. She will later, of course, be the second lady of the United States, married to Dick Cheney, who becomes vice president in 2001. But in 1984, she was a prominent conservative, prominent writer, former head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, wrote an op-ed decrying these standards as she called them the end of history. Now, she didn't mean that history is over, we'll never teach history anymore under these standards. What she meant was the history that she understood, the history of the United States, which largely focused on politicians, presidents, the great white men on parade, was less prominent and visible in these new standards that paid greater emphasis on the experience of women, people of color, sexual minorities. She argued there's too much attention here to Harriet Tubman and not enough for those great white men on parade, one of them, Robert E. Lee, a traitor to this country, slave owner, who fought in the Civil War in an effort to destroy the country. She wants more Robert E. Lee and less Harriet Tubman. Lynn Cheney's op-ed, The End of History, was part of this debate that these new standards engendered, a debate that's not just about history instruction, but again, identity. Because what we teach our children about our nation, what we teach our children about the history of our nation reflects, again, the way we think of ourselves as a nation. It's demonstrative of this idea of who we are as a nation. And that's why Cheney's response, the larger debate that followed these standards, eclipse beyond these issues of history instruction to the larger debate about American society, culture, values, what we esteem. The focus here of our final lectures on the modern culture wars. For Lynn Cheney, all this discussion of slavery, wars of aggression against Native Americans that came with thinking about African Americans and Native Americans as members of the American community, all the discussion of imperialism and immigration restrictions that came by thinking about the experience of Asian Americans in these standards. For Lynn Cheney, that meant for a grim and gloomy history. I guess for Lynn Cheney, history is supposed to be full of sunshine and happiness, right? So for Cheney and other conservatives who responded to these standards, they saw an end of the history that they understood, a history that again had been taught to them that now was changing in a way that they found troubling. And believe it or not, when these standards were released in 1994, they became a hot button issue. Now, it's very rare that any politician will opine on the content of a history textbook. It's very rare for history textbooks of all things to play a role in American politics, but many observers at the time and subsequently reflecting on this argued that the midterm elections of 1994, the pivotal, crucial midterm elections of 1994, may have been deeply influenced by this conservative backlash to these standards. Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992. 2 years later, you have the midterm elections. And in the 1994 midterm elections, Republicans made major gains. This was what was known then as the Republican Revolution, where Newt Gingrich would become Speaker of the House, and the House and later Senate would come to be controlled by Republicans. Republicans in the House under Newt Gingrich would later impeach Bill Clinton in his second term. So Clinton wins in 1992. Many saw that as a rebuke of the Reagan era, even though, as we talked about, Clinton governed in many ways as a conservative. But despite that victory in 1992, the country in the 1990s, at least in terms of Congress, would shift in a very conservative direction with the great ascendance and gains made in 1994 by the Republicans. This later had key consequence in forcing and urging Clinton into things like welfare reform, and then later, of course, in his own impeachment. And many credit the gains, the victories that offered conservatives that power in the House and later Senate, where they could influence public debate about things like AFDC and later the power to impeach the president. They won those electoral victories because many people voted for conservatives because they objected to these history standards. So here is an example of how what we teach our children, what is in our history textbooks, questions of values, influenced the 1994 elections. More recently, in 2010, there was another firestorm of debates regarding history textbooks that again played out in terms of the modern culture wars, and in particular what has been the center of the modern culture wars, these issues of race and immigration. In 2010, Texas was set to adopt a new history textbook for their K through 12 education. Now, there are 3 states that basically define the textbook market for all 50 states. They are California, New York, and Texas. Because those states are so large, whatever publisher wins those states, whatever publisher, Houghton Mifflin or whatever, wins the school districts in those states, they have such power as a result that basically the other 47 states fall in line, that those textbook publishers have such power and such influence because they dominate the largest textbook markets in California, Texas, and New York, that eventually all the other states adopt the same textbook. So whatever wins out in Texas is probably going to eventually win out in many other states. And in 2010, Texas adopted a U.S. history textbook that renamed slavery the Atlantic Triangular Trade. Isn't that a much nicer, less grim and gloomy term to describe the forced kidnapping and incarceration and labor of millions of people for centuries? It's not slavery, it's the Atlantic Triangular Trade. It renamed American imperialism, our effort to conquer, colonize the Philippines, and influence America around the globe in the late 19th, 20th, and now 21st century, expansionism. We're not conquering, we're not an empire, we're simply expanding. The Texas U.S. history textbook de-emphasized Thomas Jefferson, not because he was a slaveholder who raped his slaves and forced his own children into bondage, but instead because Thomas Jefferson coined the phrase separation of church and state and was very critical of organized religion and stylized himself as a deist. So Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, is de-emphasized in this Texas U.S. history textbook, and there's greater and greater emphasis instead on conservative figures like Phyllis Schlafly, who we discussed was the leading force against the Equal Rights Amendment, and Jerry Falwell in the moral majority. So you'll see more ink, more coverage dedicated to Phyllis Schlafly and Jerry Falwell than Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence and served as our third president. So the beat continues. The beat goes on. Now in the 21st century regarding this issue of what we teach our children about our nation. And that question is one well beyond history instruction. History instruction has never really been about a faithful description of the past. It's always been political from its very beginning, and it remains political. But the political debates regarding the textbooks, whether it's 1994 in the throes of the multicultural era or in the 21st century, in the backlash against multiculturalism, immigration, in the ways in which race and immigration play out in contemporary politics, those debates now, again, remain hot-button issues because they're really about these core questions of what we value, what we esteem, what defines us as a nation. So in this final lecture, we've tried again to tie together many different threads. It was all here, right? The Cold War, civil rights, citizenship, but do so now in reflection of the multiculturalism debate that began in the late 20th century and continues to ripple through America and now remains really the focus of our culture wars. This is our last lecture, and so let me just say I hope everyone enjoyed the class. I hope you learned a lot. It's terrible to have to do it in this online format, but this is the fate we find ourselves in this portentous moment. But nonetheless, hopefully you enjoyed these online lectures. I hope you learned a lot. Hope you did well in the course, and I hope you do well on the final exam that's coming soon.